Okay, Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. Let us resume our weekly limit of Hilchot Shabbat and Tzurba Merabanan, volume 18. I remind you, as always, that sponsorship opportunities are available. We are B'Sha'at Tova Mutzlachat. We have completed our study of Hilchot Bishul D'Oraita, and we're now going to begin learning about Hilchot Bishul D'Rabanan. As we've mentioned many times, this is maybe the more practical, more relevant, more complicated part when it comes to Hilchot Bishul on Shabbat. Specifically, we're talking about how to heat up food. Remember, there's always two stages in this. I've said this many times, and I'll just say it again. But whenever we look at the question of whether we can heat up food on Shabbat, and this would apply to, as we'll see, both leaving food on the fire before Shabbat as well as returning food to the fire on Shabbat. So the question we want to ask ourselves is, number one, are we transgressing any melacha d'oraita? Meaning if the food is already fully cooked, or alternatively, if I'm not doing anything on Shabbat itself, so then I'm not transgressing bishul d'oraita. That's okay. But that is just shlav aleph, that is stage one. Stage two is there anything here, is there a isur d'rabanan in terms of the action that I'm doing? And there are two primary concerns which Rabbanan had. If you turn over to page 119, you will see the three categories, the three halachot that we look at, what we call shehiyah, chazara, and hatmana. These are essentially the three gzerot rabbanan when it comes to cooking on Shabbat. And essentially the reason behind all of them, the concern is one of two. Our concern is that either what we're about to do is going to lead somebody to stoke the coals. Okay, we'll have to see what the modern application of stoking the coal is. Nowadays, we use electricity or gas or whatever it is, so we aren't going to stoke coals as such, but maybe turning up the heat, that may be equivalent, and that would be an isur melacha, but probably an isur d'oraita on Shabbat. Or there's another concern that Rabbanan were worried about, that it may be what's called michzikim bashal, that it may look like cooking. So what we'll discuss today, shehiyah, is going to relate more to the first concern in terms of that we may stoke the coals, we may raise the heat, etc. Michzik and mashal, looking like cooking, is going to be more relevant when it comes to chazara, as we'll see that in future shiurim. So one final point of introduction, as I said, we need a little bit of patience when it comes to this topic. I know people ask if we can be a little bit more practical and get to the bottom line halacha, which we will. But in order to get there are a lot of principles and a lot of fundamentals that we need to go through first. So bear with me as we go through the principles. We understand them. The better that we understand the principles, the better we're able to understand the bottom line halacha at the end of the day. Because there are many, many complicated questions and complicated issues that come up, particularly with chazara. But today we're talking about shehiyah as well. Okay, so just a reminder that if you have a look on page 120 in the book, so you'll see there are 5 possible stages of cooking food. Food goes on a spectrum from raw to cooked. We start off with the raw food, right? Then we have the stage what we call machal ben drusai, which is defined as something which could be eaten, right? If you're very, very hungry and you're very desperate, you would eat it, but it's not cooked. Everybody agrees it's not cooked. How do we define machal ben drusai? We'll discuss in more detail, but it's probably half cooked or a third cooked, something like that. How do we define whether it's half cooked or a third cooked? Right? Does that go according to timing? Does it go according to a different parameter? We'll see that later on. Then we get to mevushal kol tzorko. We get to fully cooked. So you may think, okay, that's it. What's left after the food is fully cooked? It's never that simple, right? After the food is fully cooked, we have either what's called mitztamek v'yafelo or mitztamek v'ralo, which means once the food is fully cooked and is left on the fire, is that going to be beneficial or is that going to be detrimental? So certain foods like cholent, right, we say it would be beneficial. The longer that it's left on the fire, the better it would be. Other foods, it's going to be detrimental, and that may have a halachic nafkamina as well. Okay, important to remember those different categories. And then, of course, when it comes to liquids, we have a slightly different terminology as we've discussed in the past. All right, so let's begin. Let's look at this concept of shehiyah. Again, our question is, we want to leave food, raw food, cooked food, whatever it is, we want to leave our food on the fire before Shabbat. We want to leave it on the fire when Shabbat comes in because we want the food to stay hot. Are we allowed to do that? So again, on a d'oraita level, on a Torah level, there is no prohibition whatsoever. Even if the food is fully raw before Shabbat comes in, when I put it on, if I take my pot and I leave it on the fire, it's completely uncooked food, meat, whatever it is, and I put it on a second before Shabbat begins. Not recommended to wait to leave it that late. But on a d'oraita level, I have not transgressed anything. I'm not cooking because the food is there by itself. This is what we're page 120. in volume 18. I haven't done anything. We discussed last week between Mincha and Mariv, right, about the Machloket Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel about Shvitat Kelim. Right, we pass like Beit Hillel, who says Shvitat, there is no issue of Shvitat Kelim. Therefore, if your food is cooking itself on Shabbat, that is no issue. Okay, an interesting question which has started to come up and will continue and will come up is nowadays you have smart homes and all sorts of things and artificial intelligence, Alexa, whatever it is. Could you say to Alexa on Shabbat, assuming that your Alexa is connected to your oven, which I'm sure can be done, right? Can you say on Shabbat, cook me breakfast, lunch, whatever it is? Short answer, no, you cannot do that. But that's not what we're talking about. Here we're talking about you leave the food on, you've done it all before Shabbat. Okay. So, midrabanan, we see this is a little bit more complicated. And again, the reason why it's complicated is Rabbanan said, what's going to happen if I leave food on the fire before Shabbat? Okay, but just before I go out to shul, whatever it is, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, depending on whether it's summer, the winter, whatever, 7 o'clock in the afternoon, whatever time it is, I'm going to leave my food on, and I go to shul. And I come back after Mariv with all my guests, right? And we want to sit down and we want to eat supper. And we go to the kitchen and we see that the food's not ready yet. So what happens? A person gets very, very stressed. The person starts to get concerned. I want this food to get, we need to serve. We want it to get ready quicker. So what are you going to do? You're going to start stoking the coals. You're going to turn up the temperature. You're not going to think about it, right? Chazal say, we find towards the end of Masechet Shabbat, a number of interesting sugyas as well, where Chazal tell us, Adam bahul al mamono. Okay, there's a concept that a person is very, I don't know how you translate bahul, but a person becomes very frantic when it comes to one's money, right? So Chazal made certain allowances when it comes to food as well. A person gets very, 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 very stressed, right? We want the food to be ready on time. So we're concerned that you're going to start stoking the coals, you're going to start making it hotter, you're not going to think about it, and and that way you're going to transgress. So Chazal said, look, you have to put in place either when it comes to the amount by which the food is ready, or either you have to put into place something relating to the fire that's going to remind you, that's going to stop you, that's going to prevent you from coming to do this on Shabbat. So let's have a look. The Mishnah Berurah gives a long introduction. It's unusual, not completely unique, but generally speaking, the Mishnah Berurah just tells us, it's very short, it's very concise, tells us what the halakha is here, what the halakha is there. Sometimes, particularly when you have a very complicated sugya, the Mishnah Berurah gives us a long introduction. Mishnah Berurah was written by the Chafetz Chaim. He wrote it together with his son. So they tell the story that once they were traveling on a train, and to really appreciate, many people will open up the Mishnah Berurah, just like we do in the Shiur. You open it up, you see a line here, you see a line there, okay. But in order to understand the genius and to appreciate what went into it, right? How was the Mishnah Berurah written? Where the Chafetz Chaim, together with his son, they learned. They started with the Psukim. They went through the Mishnah. They went through the Gemara. They went through the Sugya. They learned every single Sugya of an Iyun. Open up every single one of the Rishonim they had access to. Open up every single one of the Achronim they had access to. Okay, this is a serious, amazing work of scholarship. When you've learned the entire sugya through the Torah, through the Beit Yosef, through all the poskim, and then you see how the Mishnah Berurah paskins this way or that way, and you understand the genius that goes into it. So the Chafetz Chaim's son said to him, we're spending hours and hours, we're sweating away, we're toiling away over this work, and people are just gonna, open up the book and see 2 lines here, mutar asur. Is it really worth it? So the story is, the Chafetz Chaim said to him, we're traveling. This was at a time when the trains were a new invention. He says, the train tracks that we just passed, do you know how many hours it took to lay those tracks for the construction for that? We just passed through in a matter of seconds. Okay. Point was, it's worth it, and it's still worth the effort, and people will get the benefit. So here the Mishnah Berurah gives us this introduction, because without this introduction, it's very, very difficult to understand the sugya. So let's go through, and then we will, as is our usual practice, go back to see the source in the Gemara, some of the Rishonim, etc. So he says here we're in source number 1. Unusual. We're starting this year with source number 1, page 120. Hine, Nesha Siman Hazel, Rabu Perotav, וכדי שלא יבלבל עיני הקורא בו, אמרתי להעתיק מספר מחצית השקל, פתיחה קטנה אליה, מקרה הדינים שלה, כדי שירוץ הקורא בו. In other words, this was not actually written by the Chafetz Chaim himself. He says, I'm giving you this introduction, which was written by V'machtzit shekel, but you need to be familiar with these concepts, otherwise the siman will not make sense. Again, this is siman Reish Nun Gimel, in the Shulchan Aruch. This is right near the beginning of Hilchot Shabbat. As you remember, because it's written chronologically. These are the dinim which are relevant when Shabbat comes in, right at the beginning on Friday afternoon. So he says that sheyesh inyan shehiyah, v'yesh inyan chazara. Okay, two separate concepts we have to understand: shehiyah and chazara. Shehiyah, mikrei shenoten tavshil me'erev Shabbat al gabei kira, lo derech hatmana umanicho omed al gabei kira u'b'Shabbat notel me'akira. So shehiyah relates to when I place the dish on the, here it says kira. When you look in the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, it talks about a kira, it talks about a tanur, it talks about different types of ovens that existed in the days of the Mishnah and the Gemara. Nowadays our ovens are slightly different, but the point is, call it an oven, call it a stove, whatever you want, but the heating element, we'll discuss hot plates, etc. But shehiyah is where you place your food on the heating element before Shabbat, right, in order to keep it hot. Chazara, מקרה כשניחה מערב שבת על גבי קירה בשבת נוטלו מהקירה ורוצה להחזירה שנית על גבי קירה. So chazara has got shehiyah built in as well. Chazara means when you've left the food has been on the hot plate before Shabbat, and now on Shabbat itself, you take it off, you want to serve, then you want to put it back. Okay. So chazara we'll get to later on, but right now we're dealing with the shehiyah. But the reason both are brought together is because the Mishnah discusses both, and it's not clear which one it's talking about, and that's what we have to understand. That's where the machloket begins. We have a machloket, pligei Chananya v'Rabbanan. Okay, machloket Tanaim between we have Chananya and Rabbanan. So what are the two opinions? Opinion number one is Chananya. It says Chananya svira le. Im atavshil kvar nitbashel k'machal ben drusai hu kechatzi bishul v'yeshom keshlish bishul. Right, if your food is already half cooked or a third cooked, it's reached the stage of machal ben drusai, which again, it's not fully cooked, but it's at the point where you could eat it if you're really desperate. So he says, as long as the food has reached that stage, mutar lashota al gabei kira, afilu meina grufa min hagechalim veina ktuma. Okay, you are allowed to leave it on the fire, even if you have not done what's called grifa or ktima. Okay, we'll get to that a little bit later. But essentially, as I said, there's two parameters when it comes to whether I can leave my food on the fire before Shabbat. One parameter relates to the food itself. One parameter relates to the fire. Okay, let's forget about the fire for the moment. If the fire is covered or whatever, that's going to be essentially you're performing an action that's going to stop you from stoking the coals. But let's assume right now we're dealing with an open flame. So when it comes to an open flame, Chananya says, so long as your food has reached the stage of partial cooking, that's good enough. Why? Because meaning it's ready enough that you're not going to come back. You're going to come home. You're going to say, okay, the food's nearly ready. It's machal ben drusai anyway. We don't have to go and turn up the heat. That is his opinion. Now, Chachamim sveralu de'asur imena grufa ktuma ela im ken yibashel kol tzorko u'mitztamek v'ralo. Okay, so it's quite an extreme machloket. Chachamim say not only does the food need to be fully cooked, it needs to be fully cooked to the extent that if it's left on the fire for longer, it's going to be detrimental. Not mitztamek v'afela, rather mitztamek v'rala. Okay, all of this relates to an open flame. If the flame is covered, so it's a different parasha. But we're talking about an open flame. Chananya says, so long as the food is third cooked or half cooked, Chachamim say no, the food has to be fully cooked, reached its peak, its max. So that is the machloket in the Gemara. It's based on how we read the Mishnah. We'll see in a moment. Who do we paskin like? Paskua Rifa Rambam v'amdim b'shitatam k'Rabbanan dechananya ta'afil leshot ba'inan al gabei grufa u'ktuma. Okay, so the Rif and the Rambam are going to be more stringent. Yeah, they hold like Chachamim. V'atosfot paskua leshot mutar afil aleina grufa mishneh bashar k'machal ben drusai k'chananya. And Tosfot, we'll see Rashi as well, hold like the lenient opinion, like Chananya. So now in the last paragraph on page 121 in bold. הן שתי הדעות שהובאו בשולחן ערוך, בסימן זה דעה אחת היא דעת הריף הרמב"ם, ויש אומרים שמביא המחבר בסוף הסעיף הוא דעת רש"י והתוספות. זהו מה שבאנו בקצרה, מעתה נבוא לבאר את דברי שולחן ערוך בעזרת השם. Okay, very nice that we've seen the introduction of the Mishnah Berurah. Now we should actually see the Gemara so we understand what he's talking about. But those are the two opinions. That's what he's clarifying for us. That there are two opinions when it comes to when am I allowed to leave food? Again, midrabanan. Before Shabbat, I want to leave my pot of food on an uncovered flame. According to one opinion, so it needs to have reached the stage of partial cooking, right? That it could be eaten if I'm desperate. According to the other opinion, it needs to have reached the stage of where it is fully cooked. Okay? Like I say, if the flame is covered, and we'll discuss what exactly that means and what does it mean the flame is covered, then everybody will agree. If the flame is covered, I can eat whatever food I want on it in terms of shehiyah. But what we see from this, whether we paskin like Chananya or whether we paskin like Chachamim, right? So they disagree as to which stage the food has to reach, but what do they agree on? They agree if the food is before the stage of Machal Ben Drusai, then I'm not allowed to, meaning it's not, we'd say partially cooked, but certainly you can't eat it at all. What the Gemara is going to call bashil velo bashil, meaning it started to cook, but it's not finished by any stretch of the imagination. That everybody is going to agree. Food at that stage you cannot leave on an uncovered flame before Shabbat comes in. Okay, as I said, it's going to take us a while to get to the practicality, so bear with me. When we get to a hot plate, for example, a hot plate of Shabbat, most authorities will say that a hot plate is considered a covered flame. So a lot of this machloket will not actually be relevant, but it's important to understand where the distinction comes from and what the fundamentals are. So now let's move on to source number 2. Let's see the Mishnah and the Gemara that we've just been explaining. You see, by the way, there's a diagram here at the bottom of page 122. This is the kira. This is the way imagine sort of like a tabun that you have today. This is the way that they cooked and heated up their food in the days of the Mishnah. You have the fire underneath. Right here, it's actually fire. It's coals. That's why we're talking about stoking the coals. And it has 2 outlets for the heat. Right. The Gemara also talks about there's what's called a kupach, which only has one place to put a pot. The Gemara also has what's called a tanur, which today tanur means an oven, but there is a much higher form of heat. Okay, and it talks about different appliances. In any event, so let's see. This is the now parak kira, right? The third parak of Masechet Shabbat. Source number 2. The Mishnah says as follows. So it says kira shesikua bekashu bigvava notnim alea tafshil begefet uveitzim lo yiten ad sheiguf or ad sheiten ta'efel. Okay, so the first thing is our Mishnah tells us when it comes to a kira or comes to this sort of oven, it depends what you've used, what fuel you've used for the fire. There are certain things like straw where we are not concerned. It says if it's straw, you can place whatever you want on it, again, before Shabbat. If it's gefet v'eitzim, these are pulp from sesame seeds and olives and the like, then you would have to either achi grof. Achi grof means you sweep away the coals, or achi yiten ta'efer, that you put ashes on top of them. Right? One of those, that's what we call grifa uktima. One of those actions would make it that impossible, or it would prevent you from stoking the coals, either because the coals are no longer there, or because you have put there's difference of opinion exactly why covering is going to help. Is it because it's something that is a symbolic that reminds you? Is it something that's lowered the heat significantly, that soaking the coals now is not going to help? The reason why we don't say this when it comes to cash, etc., is those are materials which are not going to generate coals, and therefore that's not a concern. Okay, then the Mishnah goes on. It says, Beit Shammai omrim chamin avalot tafshil, Beit Hillel omrim chamin v'tafshil, Beit Shammai omrim notlin avalot machzirin, and Beit Hillel omrim af machzirin. Okay, and this is where it starts to get a little bit complicated, because what the Mishnah tells us that there's machloket Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai says you can put water. Chamin over here does not mean sholem. Chamin means hot water in this case. You can put water but not food. Beit Hillel says even food. And then Beit Shammai says you can place but don't put back. And Beit Hillel says even put back. What exactly are Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel arguing about when they say you can put food or you can put water or not? Are they arguing about shehiyah or are they arguing about chazara? This is what the Gemara spends a long time trying to understand, trying to work out the Mishnah. Let's just see briefly. And this is where the whole machloket we saw before between Chananya and Chachamim, this is where it comes from. The Gemara says, Hai lo yitain, lo yachzirhu aval ishot mashin afal pi she'eno galuf ve'eno katum, umani Chananya hi. Right? When it says you cannot place, right? Meaning even before we get to Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, right? The first line, if you go back to 122, the first line in the Mishnah that said, Lo yitain ad she'igrof or ad she'itain ta'efen. And the Mishnah said you cannot place the food until you have swept away the coals. What is that referring to? It says, ask the Gemara, does it mean lo yitain lo yachziru? That's talking about on Shabbat, that you can't, if the fire is not covered, that you cannot place the food back. That would relate to chazara, which is not the topic of today's shiur. If the Gemara there is talking about chazara, that means aval lishhot okay, which is an action that you do before Shabbat, that's going to be more lenient. So lishot mashin afapisha no garuf no katum. The implication would be that you can leave food before Shabbat on an uncovered fire. And that, whose opinion is that? That's the opinion of Hananya. The Tanya Hananya omer koshu kamachal ben rosai mutar lashot al gabe kira afapisha no garuf no katum. Or Dilma, says the Gemara, or maybe not. Maybe what it means to say is lishhotnan. When the Gemara says you need a covered, the Mishnah says you need a covered flame in order to place the food, that relates to placing the food before Shabbat. All the more so would be regarding Chazara. Okay, and that would be the opinion of Chachamim. So bottom line, at this point, we have a machloket how to understand our Mishnah. When our Mishnah says, that you cannot place your pot on an uncovered fire, but it doesn't say when. Does that mean you cannot place your pot on an uncovered fire before Shabbat, and that would be the stringent opinion of Chachamim, or does it mean you cannot place your pot on an uncovered fire on Shabbat, but before Shabbat you can leave your pot on an uncovered fire, and that would be the opinion of Hananya. Again, all of that is once it's reached the stage of Machal ben Rusai, half or third cooked. As I said, if it's not cooked before that, so that would still be there, we'd still need to be stringent. So let's see what the Rishonim say. Over the page 124. Yeah. Are we okay up to this point? Everybody's with me? Okay. Again, the question is, what we're dealing with, we're not sure. The Gemara is not sure what the Mishnah is talking about. The Gemara is not sure if the Mishnah is talking about where it says you can't leave the pot, if it's talking about before Shabbat or after Shabbat. Okay, and that's why we don't know how he passed it. What we do know is the following. We know that Hananya holds, when it comes to Shehiyah, Hananya holds before Shabbat, you can leave your pot that is reached Machal ben Rusai, you can leave it on an uncovered flame. Once it's reached that stage, I'm not concerned you're going to stoke the coals. Chachamim say no. So long as your food is not fully cooked, I'm concerned you're going to stoke the coals. So either it has to be fully cooked, or the coals have to be covered so that you can't stoke them. That everybody would agree is okay. So let's see the Rishonim and Shulchan Aruch, and let's see how we pass them. Source number 3, page 124. Says the Rambam, Ketzad, Tafshil shelo bashel kotzoko. Again, this will apply for food. This applies to water as well, by the way. What is uncooked water? Water that's not boiling, water that's cold. So this would be, it's going to be relevant to if I have an urn. When do I have to turn the urn on? What stages I have to reach, etc. Okay, food that is not fully cooked. Or tafshil shebashel kotzoko, v'koz man shemitztameku yafelo, right? Or food that is תפשיר שבשל קוצקו וכל זמן שמסתמק הוא יפה לו, אין משין אותו על גבי האש בשבת, אף על פי שהוא נח במוד... Okay, so let's forget about that ויפה לו for a moment, but he says, אין משין אותו על גבי האש בשבת, אף על פי שהוא נח מבעוד יום, we won't leave the food on the fire from before Shabbat, even though you placed it before Shabbat. Why? גזירה שמא יחטא בגחלים, we're concerned that you're going to stoke the coals in order to speed up the cooking process. Okay, so this is the stringent opinion. That is the Rambam holding like Chachamim. Rashi, on the other hand, you see source number 4, he says, Rashi says, this is the practice, this is what we do. We leave pots on the stove, and we haven't covered up the coals or removed them. So Rashi is telling you, he says, we rely on Hananya, because Stam Mishnah is like him. Again, depending on how we read the Mishnah, how we learn the Gemara. So Rashi is lenient, like Hananya. The Rambam here is Machmir. And now I mentioned this before. The point that everybody is going to agree on is the stage where it is bashil velo bashil, where it started cooking, but it's not cooked yet. That's what the Gemara says in a different place. It says bashil shapir dami, bashil velo bashil asur. You cannot put food that is cooked but isn't really cooked, that you cannot leave on the fire. Now, the Beit Yosef says you could explain that according to either opinion. That's not going to tell us a proof as to how we paskin, because like this, he says, What does it mean, bashil velo bashil? Look at page 125, source number 6. Here in bold, he says, Ledata rif v'siato me'et she'tchil et bashel ben shelo egia lamachal ben drusai ben she'egia afilu bashel kotzoko. He says it's cooked, but it's not cooked, means it's not fully cooked. So it started cooking, even if it got to the stage of ben drusai, even if it got to the stage of fully cooked, but it's mitzamek v'ralo. That's but it's mitzamek v'afelo. That is still considered as not fully cooked, and therefore I can explain the Gemara that way. On the other hand, the second paragraph, I could explain this Gemara according to Rashi and his co-op, right? That Rashi v'siato kol shegena machal ben drosai mikre bashil v'shapir dami l'shuye. Meaning, what does it mean? Not cooked. That means it hasn't gone into ben drosai. Okay, so let's see here the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, source number 7. Again, I know this is a little bit confusing, and the truth is that this machloket probably at the end of the day isn't too relevant, because, like I say, most of the time we're going to be dealing with a covered flame, and therefore stuff. But situations do come up, so it's important to know. So source number 7 says the Shulchan Aruch. He says, "Kirash yasuya kikdera shuftin al pia kdera lemala v'yesh b'makom shvitat shtei kderot." That's just the definition of the kira. Okay. Imuska begefet shipsolet shazetim or beitzim. In bold, you cannot place your pot over there before Shabbat. Only if it is fully cooked and continued time on the heat is going to be detrimental. Only then you can put it on an uncovered flame. So that is the Shulchan Aruch paskening like the Rambam who paskens like Chachamim. Okay, stringent opinion. Yafeh. Doesn't end there. It continues. If it's cooked a little bit but not fully cooked, or even if it is fully cooked but it's going to get better, okay, then we're worried, then we're concerned, you'll stoke the coals, and it's only if you have covered them that you can leave the food there. That is opinion number 1. Turn over the page. 1 to 6, the Shulchan Aruch continues. V'yeshomrim. That's simple, right? There are those who say, Shekol shenipashel k'ma'achal ben drosai, or shenipashel kotzokov v'mitzamek v'yafelu, mutar lashoto gabei gerim. There are those who say, actually, so long as it's already reached ma'achal ben drosai, you can leave it on the fire before Shabbat. That is the opinion of Rashi and Tosfot, which is the opinion of Chananya. Okay, so we have 2 opinions in the Shulchan Aruch, and we know, we've learned many times, that when you have 2 opinions in the Shulchan Aruch, you have Stam and Yesh Omrim. We paskin like? Right, when we have Stam, if we have Yesh v'Yesh, then we go like the second Yesh. But if we have Stam and Yesh Omrim, we hold like Stam, like the first opinion. Okay, so based on that, it would seem that we are stringent. It would seem that the Shulchan Aruch over here is stringent. Okay, the Ramah, however, says Nagula Kel. Don't say you never get surprises in the shiur. Normally we're used to the Shulchan Aruch saying we're lenient and the Ashkenazim are machmir. So over here this is the case where the Shulchan Aruch is stringent and the Ashkenazim are mekilim. The Ramah says no, we hold like the second opinion, we are makel. The truth is that the Shulchan Aruch himself may also be makel. Yeah, and there's a long discussion from the Shulchan Aruch in the next siman. If you have a look at source number 9, the Shulchan Aruch quotes it in, which we mentioned last time. He says, "Perot shenechalin chayim." If I have fruits which could be eaten raw, mutar litnam sviv hakdera af al pi she'efshar sheyatzolu kodem choshecha. You're allowed to place them again before Shabbat, but you're allowed to place them around the pot in order that they'll get roasted a little bit with the pot before nightfall. Have a look at the bottom of page 127. There's a diagram there just to illustrate what the Shulchan Aruch is talking about. I have my pot, which is on the fire. And again, next to that, you have the old-fashioned gas burner. That's showing us what we're talking about. That is right, an uncovered flame. That's exactly what we're discussing. But if you place these fruits around the pot, so you see, the Shulchan Aruch says that would be allowed. Now, hang on a moment. Ask the question here. These fruits are what stage of cooking? Raw. They're completely raw when I place them. So they're not machal ben drosai. So didn't I say, according to the first opinion of the Shulchan Aruch, which we said is the opinion of the Shulchan Aruch, that if I have my food that is completely raw, I can't place it on an uncovered flame because I might come to stoke the coals. So does that mean that when the Shulchan Aruch says this in Reish Nun Daled, now Reish Nun Daled comes after Reish Nun Gimel, right? Does that mean that he changed his opinion and he's actually saying, there he wrote in Stam V'Yesh Omrim, okay? And he relied on the fact that we would learn Siman Reish Nun Daled to see that he actually changed his mind, and he's also going to be lenient. So also lenient like the Ashkenazim. So that is the view of the Vilna Gaon, right? In source number 10, it says lo gram ma'achal ben drosai l'shidadam da'achal k'ma'achal ben drosai shari. He says actually the Shulchan Aruch, yes, he does rule like the lenient opinion. There are those who disagree, who say no, this is a different case. They say what's different about this case of the Shulchan Aruch is that what do I look at? I look at what's in the pot. I don't look at the fruit. The fruits are there around the pot, but if the food in the whether a person is going to come to stoke the coals or not is based on the food that's in the pot. And if that has reached the stage of machal ben drosai, then I'm not worried about the fruits as well. So the bottom line is we have a machloket between amongst Sephardi authorities whether the Shulchan Aruch is lenient or stringent on this matter. But the Ashkenazim, the Ramah said that we can be lenient. Let's just see the Biur Halacha in source number 8, who explains this Ramah. He says, "Nagula kelkes v'achorna." The Beit Yosef, right, in the first half of the Tzurba, Rabbanan Shiur elaborated at great length about these two opinions. Ve'atik divrei harosh shekatav b'nei Yisrael adukim b'mitzvat oneg Shabbat ubevadai lo yishma'u lanu al ken hanach lahem ayen sham. Very, very interesting. The Rosh says something. He says you don't mess with Jews and their food. Essentially, that's what he says here. He says at the end of the day, the Jewish people are a beautiful language. He says, "Adukim b'mitzvat oneg Shabbat." We are dedicated to the mitzvah of oneg Shabbat. You want the Jewish people to eat cold food on Friday night? Forget about it. It's not going to happen. And therefore, let them. He says, "Anach lehem Israel." That you should let them rely on this principle. In other words, but what does that language mean? Hanach lehem. It sounds more like it's a limud zchut than saying that it's mutar lekatchila. So he says, "Mashma mizeh derak mishum zeh lo ratza limchot." He didn't want to protest. That makes it sound like the Beit Yosef is saying that it's better to be stringent. Okay, so we see this is already, Rashi said it, this is already an established practice, established minhag, Jewish people, that we rely on the lenient opinion. Al ken, לפי זה לכתחילה בוודאי טוב להיזהר שיהיה מבושל כל צורכו קודם חשיכה לסלקו מן האש. So says the Biur Halacha, therefore, even though it says nagula kel kusvar chorna, it's better here to rely on the stringent opinion. We think that way you're certainly okay. But אם Rashi נתאחר הדבר, כגון שבו הולכים קודם שקיעת החמה, והוא צריך לבשל איזה תבשיל עבורם. Things have changed a little bit in the last few centuries, right? Nowadays, right, it's, you know who your guests are, you've cooked all your food already a week before, or whatever it is. Yeah, he says you're coming home on Friday night, and Friday night you discover you're going to have guests. You need to cook something quickly. Okay, so you can rely on this just before Shabbat. אברהם יכול להעמיד על הפטפוט, לבשל אף שלא יתבשל עד השקיעה, רק כחצי בישול שקי. In other words, Biur Halacha says, bottom line is, I would prefer that we are stringent, that we rely on the stringent opinion like Chachamim, but we have what to rely on when it comes to Chananya. Okay, all of this entire discussion is when it comes to, I remind you, when it comes to an open flame. So bottom line is, just to summarize to this point, if we have an open flame, can I leave my pot of food on an open flame to continue cooking, to continue getting hot on Shabbat? So everybody will agree that if the food is fully cooked, and it's what's called mistamek varalo, there is no problem of leaving it on before Shabbat. Everybody will agree that if the food has started to cook, but it has not yet reached the stage of machal ben drosai, you may not leave it on an open flame. The only machloket we have is from the stage of machal ben drosai, which is half to a third cooked, until mitztamek v'yafel, until that it's fully cooked, but it's going to continue cooking well. According to Hananya, that's fine to leave on the open flame, and that was one opinion we saw in the Rishonim, the Shulchan Aruch. According to Chachamim, that you may not leave that on the open flame, and we said that bottom line is we try to be stringent like Chachamim, but if we need to rely on the opinion of Hananya, we can. All of that is when I'm dealing with an open flame.
Is hot coil considered an open flame?
Is what?
Hot coil.
A hot coil, like a gas burner?
No, electric.
Oh, an electric burner? Yeah.
And it's red hot.
Yeah, that would be considered, exactly, that would be considered the flame.
But a blech is also basically the same. You've got the same coil.
We're going to get to the blech. So what is the blech? A blech is when I have the coil and I have and then I have something on top of it so that it's covered. Where does this whole concept of a blech? This is where it comes from.
But the coil the Paul's talking about has glass on top of it, also covered.
You're saying that I have an electric burner that has glass on top. Okay, so that itself, that's going to be a machloket amongst Poskei Zmanei. No, the question is, since that's the way that it's designed and that's the way that it normally heats up, do I say that's considered the flame? That's the way that I normally cook on it, or would you say that since the fire itself is not actually exposed? Again, I think that you can probably find authorities to say both, but I think the general consensus would be that we would, since that's the general way of cooking, that's a normal way of that flame, we would consider that the flame, we would consider that uncovered. Both because it's the normal heat that you would use for cooking, and because you have the same concern of being able to adjust it up and down, you haven't done anything to mitigate that. Okay. Before we get to the covered flame, now there's another point, very, very important point we have to discuss. Now you've probably noticed, if you've been paying attention, that every time I spoke about machal ben drosai and what everybody agrees on, I said that if the food has started cooking, but it has not yet reached machal ben drosai. Why did I emphasize the fact that it started cooking? Because if it has not started cooking at all, if it's completely raw, this is paradoxical, everyone agrees, again, we'll see how practical this is, and there is certainly one case where it's practical, but if the food is completely raw, everybody agrees that you can leave it on the fire just before Shabbat. Okay? Why? What's the logic? The reason we're saying that I can't leave my food on the fire is because I might come to stoke the coals, I might come to hurry it up because I'm coming home from shore and I want everybody to be able to eat, want it to cook quicker. If I know that the food is going to take so long to cook, that even if I start, turning up the heat and doing whatever, it's never going to be ready in time for dinner. It's only going to be ready the next morning. So then then Chachamim were not concerned. They said a person's not going to do anything because it's so far removed. That's the case where it is completely raw. Again, once the food is once the food has started cooking, this leniency will no longer apply. Let's just see one moment. Let's just see what the Gemara says about this, and then we'll get to the question. So have a look, page 130. It says raw food, source number 14. Here is the Gemara Masechet Shabbat. It says we say we have a gzera that you may come to soak the coals to hasten the cooking. Hai gdera chayta. If I have a pot of raw meat, shari lanuch erev Shabbat im chashecha betanora. I can place it on the oven, in the oven, right? On Erev Shabbat before night. For my time, what is the reason? Since it will not be fit for consumption that night at all. A person doesn't even think about it, doesn't consider they may eat it. And therefore, you're not going to come and stoke the coals. Okay, it doesn't have to be, it says, it doesn't actually have to be the whole pot that's raw, but if I have a nice piece of meat, just one piece of meat in there that's completely raw, again, it's completely raw before Shabbat comes in, that when Shabbat comes in, that would be, that I would be allowed to leave. I'd be allowed to leave.
There'd be potatoes and beans, and if it's got all sorts of other things, it's a chulent. And besides, the meat is raw, but everything else will cook much more quickly. Is that still hold?
Right. So according to this, again, the point. There's some discussion in the Rambam, because the Rambam between his Perush Mishnayot and between the Mishnah Torah, it changes a little bit. In one place he says if there's any raw food, and in one place he says if there's any raw meat. So if I have a vegetable, something like that, I know vegetables cook much quicker. So this would apply to meat. But yes, the understanding is that if I have an important component in that food, even though the other stuff's cooked, but I have an important component in that pot that is fully raw. That I'm not going to take the pot off. I'm not going to do anything with the pot until I know that I can eat it.
So first of all, the way I understand it,
Don't be ridiculous. I wanted to cook evenly.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Secondly, so you don't have a problem with any pizza here, but but don't you? Isn't it visual goer? How can you say Again.
The question was, there's no problem here of stoking the coals, But isn't there a problem of actual bishul, of actual cooking? So again, everything we're talking about here is you've done before Shabbat. On Shabbat, I haven't done anything. If I've left my pot on the fire before Shabbat, I cannot transgress the melacha d'oraita of bishul on Shabbat. Unless I hold like Beit Shammai and I say shvitat kelim. Because on Shabbat, I haven't done anything. I've left it on before. If we're talking about, I took the pot off the fire and put it back on. I took the lid off and I put the lid back on. And that way I'm hastening the cooking. So that would be a problem of bishul. But
I'm just talking about it open. So I mean, I could go, we're not there yet, but you could say if it's a covered food to begin with, if I kind of just put anything that's not cooked, I've already have to let it cook after that.
If it's a covered flame, strictly speaking, you could do that. Okay, there's other reasons why we would advise against it, but strictly speaking, you could do that. Okay, the thing is with this raw food, why it's going to be, it starts to get a little bit tricky when we look at the practicalities of it for a couple of reasons. Let's see. First of all, the Shulchan Aruch, source number 16. He says, let's just read the part in bold. It says, Shaya chai shalom bashal kalal. It was raw, so it wasn't cooked at all. Kevan shel chai mesiach da'ato mimeno ad lemachar. But since it's raw food, I know it's in there. It's not going to be ready until tomorrow. So I'm not concerned that I'm going to come and do anything with it at night. I'm not thinking about kol halayla yachol bashal belo chitoy. I know it can cook that all night. I'm not going to stoke the coals. I'm not going to turn up the heat. I won't do anything. And he says, if I put a raw piece in it, it's like the entire dish is raw. Because by putting that raw meat in it, I'm removing my mind from the entire dish.
Putting the meat in it when?
Before Shabbat, just before Shabbat. Right. Thank you. That's an important point. So to put the raw meat in it on Shabbat would be completely forbidden. That's clear. Okay. So look at the Orchot Shabbat, source number 17. Again, the point is, now how do we define whether it's raw or it's not raw? So the easiest way would be if it reaches, when do we say that something starts cooking? When it reaches the temperature of Yad Soledet Bo, when it starts to get hot. So if I put the food in, again, depending on what appliance we're using, what form of cooking, but when Shabbat begins, it's already reached the heat of Yad Soledet Bo, then it's considered it's already started cooking. Says the Orchot Shabbat number 17. Yesh leida kevan detchilat habishul mishah shegiat tavshil lachom shayad soledet bo לכן אין היתר זה שוקדל חי תנאמר אלא באופן שהתבשיל יגיע לשיעור שיד סולד בו רק בסמוך לשקיעת החמה. Only if, there's another discussion here, when I say when does Shabbat begin? Do I say Shabbat begins when we bring in Shabbat 40 minutes before in Yerushalayim, or only when it comes to Shkia? But certainly by Shkia, right, if the food is, if I get to Shkia and the food is not yet hot, so that's considered that it's still raw, and this leniency would apply. לא קודם לכן. שאם יגיע לחום שיד סולד בו בשעה מוקדמת יותר, but if it gets hot earlier, אזי בהגיע שעת השקיעה כבר התחיל הבישול, אין זו כתר החיה. If once Shkia comes along and it's already started cooking, it's already hot, then it started cooking, and that doesn't help me. Right, the Piskei Tshuvot of Yan, source number 18, he says, אבל אם לפי תנאי הבישול בחום האש המצוי תחת הקדרה, יש באפשרות שיתבשל כל צורכו עד סעודת הלילה, אסור להשאירו על גבי האש, אינה מכוסה. Here he adds another component, why this is very, very difficult to rely on nowadays. Because, again, what is the logic here of the Gemara's of the Gemara's leniency? And this certainly applied in the form of cooking in the days of the Gemara. That if the meat is raw, when Shabbat comes in, it's not going to be ready until the morning. Now, I don't know exactly what the ovens were like in the days of the Gemara, but our ovens today cook much quicker than they did then. So it's possible that I have something that is completely raw when Shabbat comes in, but nonetheless, by the time I'm going to eat Seudat Shabbat, especially if you come to shul and you have a long Kabbalat Shabbat and there's lots of singing, Yeshvat HaKotel came, so you've got a long davening, and afterwards you're schmoozing a little bit and you get home and you have a good couple of hours before you begin the meal. The food's already ready. The food's already cooked. So then the whole reason for this, the whole logic for this leniency doesn't apply. And that's what he's saying over here. He says, according to, we have to look at the reality. If according to the conditions of cooking, the heat of the fire, it's possible that the whole thing is going to be cooked until when it's time for me to eat that night. Then I would not be allowed to, even if it is fully raw when Shabbat starts. I would not be allowed to leave it on an uncovered flame. Then I would have to rely on a covered flame. So if I have a huge pot of cholent, whatever it is, right, and it's a very, very, very large pot, and it's going to take a long time. It's going to take at least 5 hours to cook. Okay, so then that would apply. But if it's something that's much smaller, or it's in the oven, and it's, even though it's raw, it's going to be able to it could theoretically be ready for the evening meal, this leniency of K'terah Chayta would not apply. The place where it could still apply, and this is probably the only place where it could still apply nowadays, the poskim talk about, is when I have a slow cooker. Right? If I have a crock pot, which by definition takes a very, very long time to cook. So if I put the food in just before Shabbat into the slow cooker, right, so that by the time Shkia comes, sunset comes, and the food is it's not yet hot, there's no way it's going to be ready for the evening meal, even if it takes me a few hours and I'm, schmoozing whatever after shul. So then I could rely on that in terms of shehiyah, if I do consider it to be an open flame. And again, there are other concerns when it comes to a crock pot, a slow cooker. You can have a look on page 158. There's an essay here. We won't look at it now, but that discusses that. But in terms of this, let's just read from the Shabbos Kitchen, page 20. This is Rav Simcha Bunim Cohen. Rav Willig from YU rules the same way. He says, nowadays, this leniency of raw meat cannot generally be relied upon, since with modern cooking methods, almost any type of food can be cooked in a relatively short period. However, the ruling does apply with a crock pot, which cooks slowly. Therefore, it's permissible to put raw meat in a crock pot without any blech immediately before Shabbos, provided one is certain the food will not be ready for the evening meal. Moreover, even with a pot of partially cooked food, it's sufficient to put in one piece of raw meat to exempt the entire pot from requiring a blech. Okay, with a yeah.
Because if our concern, right, is or whatever,
yeah,
right at the beginning, right? So we're saying, if it's like not raw or something, we think it'll be ready, we'll do it, right? So that's a problem. Now we're saying it's going to be ready anyway. So why would anybody think in the first place that there'd be a problem with it? Because I'm not even gonna it's not even done yet. I have to go ahead and stoke the coals or whatever it is, because I know it's going to be ready. I mean, if that's the thing we're worried about. Why are we worried about it if we know it's going to be ready?
No, meaning it could be. Meaning there's a spectrum here. There's the food that will definitely cannot be ready, right? So there's no problem. There's the food that definitely will be ready. And again, how do we define? That's exactly the machloket Chananya and Chachamim, right? That's exactly meaning. At what stage of certainty that the food will be ready do I say I'm no longer worried that you're going to come and do it?
In case we're really, it's definitely yes going to be ready. We don't have that problem either.
You're saying, if I understand your question correctly, what you're saying is this: you're saying the Gemara came along and gave us estimation that said a half cooked, a third cooked, Mr. Mekvi Afela, Mr. Mekvi Alo. So nowadays, why don't we just throw all those definitions out? Because nowadays cooking is more of an exact science. Because I know that if I have an oven and it's this make and that make and have it on this temperature, whatever, I know that it's going to take 2 hours, and that's going to be, and Shalom on Israel. Essentially, that's your question.
That's one of those terms. So I'm saying if
No, I know you didn't, but that's how
you can't play with the heat because if it's not going to be ready at all, you're not going to do it. But if you think it's going to be ready anyway, then you're also not going to do it. So like the reason we're concerned doesn't exist anymore. It's in the case of the mill where there's a chance that if I do something, then I can put it over the finish line. But if I know it's not going to get there at all, or that it's definitely going to get there, then in both of those scenarios, there's no reason that I should have to wait
Come back early for sure. You thought you were going to come back at a certain time, come back half an hour early, and then you're tempted to
So maybe that's the answer. But like we thought, I think I've walked this is in the case where I know it can't be ready, or I know it can definitely be ready, I don't have that.
So the key word here is can. I know it can definitely be ready, but I don't know that it will definitely be ready. But I think that's precisely the machloket between Chananya and Chachamim. It's exactly the machloket in the Gemara. We're saying in all of this, Chazal said, what Chazal are telling us is that these things are not exact science. I like giving this quote from Rav Shavais because I think it helps us very, very nicely. Yeah, nowadays, we like to think of things in very, very exact terms. The Western mind, this is the way we think. We look at statistics, we look at numbers. When you come to halacha and you try to measure things and with exact statistics and numbers, it doesn't work that way. So for example, I don't remember exactly what the case was, but it was one of these. It was a certain medical issue or a certain question of after how long a certain thing should be done, and somebody asked Rav Shavais, and he said 13 hours, 20 minutes, and 16 chalakim. I mean, and he was being funny because it doesn't work that way. You have to look at the situation, you have to evaluate, you have to know what it is, and I think that's what Chazal are telling us here. Meaning, it's not. You look at how well the food is cooked, and our question is: does it concern human beings or human beings? A person wants to. Wants the food to be ready quicker. So we're saying there's a certain threshold, which I know that a person's not there's no risk. You're not going to come and do that. That is where there's absolutely no way. It's impossible that you can hasten the cooking process, and therefore you won't do anything. Therefore, we're not worrying. There's a certain that one's easy. That one everybody agrees. There is a certain threshold on the other side, whereby I say a person can be relaxed. That the food will be ready in time, and they're not going to have to do anything. What is that threshold? Everything in between is a machloket. But that threshold, hang on. But that threshold itself, that is the machloket. Meaning that's exactly between Chachamim and Chachamim. Chachamim say, I need to be absolutely certain. Only in a situation where the food is fully cooked, not just fully cooked, but it's meant to make varalo, meaning if it's left on the fire, even though it's fully cooked, there's still a situation. You want it to get better, you want it to cook some more, you want the chicken to break apart, whatever. So you might come and do it. Hanania says we don't have to be so extreme. Hanania says so long as the food is basically ready, a person is, you're an Elechayid, you keep halacha, you keep Shabbos, okay, you'll remember that you can't do this. Only if the food's not cooked at all, then you're going to start a cooking, but it's not cooked at all, then you're going to be so that threshold in between, that's the machloket Hanania and Chachamim, and even for Chachamim, the question is how far do we? But you like what?
There's a third parameter,
which is
there's the one case where it's not at all. There's the case that know what you don't know, and however you define it, there's a third case where you're sure it will. Whether it's only because you put a little bit in the pot, and you know that there's no way that it's not that it will definitely going to be ready. Like, there are cases we can predetermine. If this whole thing started out by saying, now we have like ovens, they take less time, right? I mean, you can see a circumstance where I can put something there, and I know it will be ready when I come home. Okay, so seemingly, I think what Chazal said is we're not going to rely on that because we're not going to rely on a person saying I know, right? We have many examples of this. For example, the one that jumps to mind is the Gemara in Shabbat, classic Gemara, where the Gemara says, the Mishnah says that a person cannot read by the light of the candle. Right, because you make up not the candles that we have nowadays, but the old candles. If you've seen these, you have the container, the clay container, which has the oil inside, and you put the wick in, and when the oil starts running out, so it starts flickering. So you would tilt the candle so that the wick would draw from the oil. So the Mishnah says, don't read lo yikra le'or haneh. Doesn't say why. And then the Gemara says that if it's an important person, we say he can. We're concerned that if you're reading by the light of the candle, you'll be so engrossed in what you're reading and what you're studying that you're not going to realize, you're going to forget that it's Shabbos, and you're going to come to tilt the candle. So it says Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, who may be in the Kohen Gadol, he says, I'm an Adam Chashuv. The Gemara has a leniency. It says from Adam Chashuv. He says, I can read by the light of the candle. So what does he do? He's reading by the light of the candle, and the candle starts flickering. So he wants to tilt it. Oh, suddenly he remembers of Shabbat, and he says, "Kama gdolim divrei chachamim." How great are the words of the sages that said, "I shouldn't do this." That's one version of the Gemara. The other version of the Gemara is that he did tilt the candle, and he says, "Kama gdolim divrei chachamim," and he writes in his pinkas. He used to carry around a little notebook, and he says, "I'm going to have to bring a korban chatat to the Beit HaMikdash." Right? It's a good job we don't carry such notebooks around with us, because they would be. He didn't write it on Shabbos. No, he wrote it afterwards. But so I'm saying, so Chazal say, okay, you think you know, you don't know. Okay, so we're not going to rely on that. What we will rely on is, and we'll discuss this next week, and this is where it's going to get very, very practical and very relevant, is if we put something in place, something additional in place, aside from how cooked the food is, that's going to stop you, it's going to prevent you from stoking the coals. It might mean that we significantly lower the heat, so even if you want to, you can't make it cook quicker. Or we'll cover things up so that even if you want to, there's no practical, tangible way for you to hasten the cooking, right? And that's Grifa Uktima. So just to summarize, I think Machal ben Josai will leave for next week, but just to summarize what we've said until now is the following. I want to heat food up for Shabbat, right? We saw the Rosh, we saw how important, we said we don't mess with the Jewish people and their food, okay? We have to find ways to allow it. And nowadays with modern technology,
People say modern technology makes it so much more difficult, keeping halakha and all these things actually makes it a lot easier, right? We don't have all this, the whole, because of modern technology, basically the whole shiur today was not halakha l'maaseh, right? But what we're saying is this. What we're saying is there is a concern, Abin Isho, there's a concern that if a person leaves their food cooked, uncooked, whatever stage, on the fire before Shabbat, we're worried that you might want to hasten the cooking on Shabbat, and you may come to stoke the coals, which in modern terms means you might come to turn the heat up to make it cook quicker. So I have to eliminate that concern in order to allow you to leave your food on the fire before Shabbat. How do I eliminate that concern? There are two ways that I can do it. One way is by covering the flame. Covering the flame, we'll see exactly how that translates nowadays, what that means. Moving the coals away or covering them up with dust. We'll see exactly today. That may mean a blech. That may mean covering up the buttons. It may mean doing both. Okay, that is, if I do that, so then I can leave whatever I want on the fire, completely raw food, I can leave it on the fire before Shabbat, and there's no issue. Again, as I said, there are other peripheral issues, and it would always be better advised to have the food cooked before Shabbat. But nonetheless, if the fire is covered, whatever that means, I can leave whatever food I want on the flame from before Shabbat. If the fire is not covered, so it's an open flame, so here we say the following. If the food is fully cooked and it's what's called mitzvah mikvaralo, no problem. You can leave it on. If the food is completely raw, it hasn't started cooking, no problem. You can leave it on. But in order for it to be completely raw means that it's not going to cook in time. It's not going to be hot when Shabbat comes in. And that would probably only apply nowadays in a crock pot. Okay? What is the big machloket? The big machloket is if the food is from the stage of machal ben before, this is when Shabbat comes in. If the food is somewhere from the stage of machal ben drusai until completely cooked, okay, according to Chachamim, you may not leave it there. According to Hananya, you may leave it there. How do we paskan? We said we try to be stringent for the opinion of Chachamim, but we can rely on the opinion of Hananya if necessary. Okay. Next week, so we'll go into a little bit more detail in terms of machal ben drusai. We'll see what exactly is considered covering it up, and we'll see how this translates precisely into blechs, hot plates, etc. Okay.
Sure.
The dreadful translation of this stage.
Oh no.
Page 121. Even if its coals have been removed, even if its coals have not been removed. it should
Okay,
say,
signing off.
"Leave it on the stove. I feel an anal groove.